This podcast is brought to you by The Current. Ever wanted to sit down to a candid conversation with the marketing leaders of the world's biggest brands? The Current podcast is your chance. On The Current podcast, you'll find exclusive interviews with the experts and trendsetters who are on the front lines of digital advertising, and they always leave the ad tech jargon at the door. Subscribe to The Current at www.thecurrent.com or anywhere you get your podcast today.
Hi, I'm Ari Paparo here with the Advertising Forum and the IAB Tech Lab at the International Summit. I'm happy to have Mathieu Roche from ID5 with me. Mathieu, thanks for being here.
Morning, Ari. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so the name of this conference is Nothing Will Be the Same. What does that mean to you and to ID5?
Oh, wow. It feels like it's our mission statement. You know, we started ID5 to replace legacy identifiers, right? Cookie IDs, IDFAs, et cetera, et cetera. But it was really 7 years ago. And already 7 years ago, we thought the future was not going to be the same because privacy regulation, platform changes would force us to adopt new ways of recognizing users. So that's been a longer transition than most people expected, but it's definitely a transition. And so the future will never be the same because we'll be using better, more scalable, more privacy compliant method to recognize people and power advertising. And I like to think that today's the beginning of it.
All right, the beginning of the future, end of the past. So for those of us who aren't that familiar with ID5, you have a sort of a global footprint of IDs. Well, tell us the basics about what it is.
Yeah, our job is to create IDs to help brands and publishers recognize people to power advertising, right? Advertising relies on the ability to recognize customers so that you can target, you can measure, you can optimize the delivery of campaign. That's what makes digital more valuable than linear, for instance, right? Because you know who you're talking to, you can optimize the way you talk to them, and you can measure the outcome. All of that relies on the ability to recognize who you're talking to. So identity is really a fundamental layer that supports all digital advertising. Right. On the web, we've been using cookies. In mobile apps, we've been using IDFAs and and Google Ad IDs. In TV, we're using IP addresses, we're using device IDs. So there's all sorts of legacy identifiers that have been available, that have been powering this industry of ours for the past 20 years. And all of them are kind of either slowly being deprecated by their owners, right? Yeah. The browsers, the OS, et cetera, or they're not kind of built to pass the bar of compliance, right? In terms of transparency, in terms of control for users to say opt in, opt out, all of those things are not really baked into those legacy identification method. So ID5's job is to reinvent this infrastructure, right? We've rebuilt it from the ground up with a notion of availability across all platforms, across all channels, and a notion of compliance, embedding the user consent into the ID itself, so that we've created this abstraction layer that sits on top of a complex technical environment and a complex legal environment, right?
That's changing. So how is it future-proof? How do we know that?
Well, we handle that complexity and those changes, right? So if when a new law passes in the US or in Japan, or like new requirements come, we're able to embed them into the ID and say, you know what? I'm taking a silly example because it doesn't happen. Like it was opt-out, it's becoming opt-in. The way we generate ID will change to reflect this. But as a user, as a platform using the ID5 infrastructure, if you get the ID, if you can use the ID, it's because you are allowed to use the ID. Right. We take care of that complexity. We create that abstraction layer so that the technical and the legal complexity are abstracted, and our clients can leverage our infrastructure at scale without being worried about, oh, is that a device that I can use an ID for? Is that a cookie? Is that a mail? Is that something else? No, it's an ID5 stable ID5 infrastructure that you can build on top of.
You just said ID4. What's ID4?
No. I said ID5. Slip of the tongue.
Slip of the tongue. Okay, I thought you were branching out.
No.
So speaking of the future, what can you prognosticate for us a bit about this whole space, about identity, privacy, et cetera?
So from a privacy standpoint, it's interesting because a lot of people consider privacy as anonymity, effectively, right? I don't want to be recognized. Privacy, as defined by regulation, is not anonymity. And when you look at what's happening on social media in particular, anonymity is not necessarily where we want to go into, right? So data protection regulation says notice and consent, notice and control, right? Like you have to tell me what you're going to do with my data, right? And you have to give me a choice to opt in or opt out into that transaction, right? That's what all regulations all over the world are based on. Okay. Might be more stringent than others. Some say you've got to tell me and allow me to opt out. Others say you've got to tell me and ask me to opt in, but basically it's the same principles. we're not going to change kind of the basics, the parameters of the data protection regulation for the next 20 years or so, because this is what the past 20 years have led us to, and there's no reason for that to change. So the question is, how do we comply with those transparency and those control requirements, which again is something that we can embed. So that's from a privacy standpoint. Then technically, how do you actually make it happen, right? And we have to work in a world where device signals are being limited, and so it's a question of scale. The more device you see, the more signals you get, the better you will be at predicting that this is your phone that I'm seeing right now on CNN after having seen it on the IBM website. And so if IBM wants to retarget you, they can use that ID.
And now it's moving into TVs, right?
It's moving identity is not a cookie thing, right? Identity is a fundamental principle for advertising. Again, when we're talking about addressability, measurement, frequency capping, all of those things are not web things. They're advertising things, right? So the web has been the visible part of the iceberg because we've had a very pressing need to replace cookies that are already not available on about half of the devices that connect through a browser.
Yeah.
So the pain is more obvious there, but it exists everywhere, and it exists on TV where we're using IP addresses, not very stable, not necessarily very safe from a data protection standpoint. In mobile apps where we've been using IDFAs that require consent to Apple, which isn't always available. So those technical and regulatory challenges exist on all platforms.
Yeah.
And ID5's position is not to be just a cookie replacement. It's to be an advertising identity infrastructure for all channels globally.
All right. Well, that was great. So on behalf of Advertising Forum and IAB Tech Lab, thank you so much for being here, Mathieu.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Marketecture Podcast. New episodes come out every Friday, and an insightful vendor interview is published each Monday. You can subscribe to our library of hundreds of executive interviews at marketecture.tv. You can also sign up for free for our weekly newsletter with my original strategic insights on the week's news at news.marketecture.tv. And if you're feeling social, we operate a vibrant Slack community that you can apply to join at adtechgod.com.